Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, I'm talking about my top 5 albums of 2024 so far. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So far, 2024 has been an incredible year for music. A lot of really great stuff has come out this year, especially when it comes to rock. There's a lot of stuff kind of flown under the radar that I really didn't even have, anywhere on my radar before the year started that I've absolutely loved since they've come out. So kind of the lead up to this video, I poured over probably my top 20 or 25 albums, tried to narrow it down to just 5. I really couldn't, so I've got my top 5, and I've got a bunch of honorable mentions also. So I'll go through my honorable mentions first, and then I'll get to my top 5. The honorable mentions aren't in any kind of order. They're all ones I just kind of considered for my top 5. The first one, this is the Black Crowes, Happiness Bastards. This came out back on March 15th. I never thought I would see the Black Crowes release music again. I mean, it'd been, 10 or 15 years since they released music together. Of course, all the infighting, everything that has gone on within this band. But this is an album that really kind of, I think it's really a return to form album for the band. I absolutely love this one. This one, it just kind of fell just outside my top 5, but one I've listened to quite a bit since it came out. So this next album is one I didn't have any clue who the band was or anything about this album. And then, earlier this year, I think it might have been late last year, the band sent in a single to the Mike Herrera podcast. He played it on one of his episodes. And I really enjoyed the song. And then finally, when this album came out, I grabbed a copy. I pre-ordered it when they first put up the pre-orders on the website. It's been one of my most played albums of the year so far. This one came out back on January 19th. This is the debut album from Stankfinger, Three Finger Discount. So this is very much like old school ska punk is probably the best way to put it. If you're a fan of like late 90s, early 2000s Less Than Jake, this is a band you definitely want to check out. The next album is the most recent release on my list. It's been a great year for punk music in 2024, and I've really been enjoying the new album by The Story so far. I Wanted to Disappear. I actually did a review of this on the channel within the last week or two. This is a band I never really got into. I never really checked out, I should say, until it was probably about a year or so ago when the first single off this album was dropped by the band. And I heard it on, I think it was Sirius when I heard that song. And like right away, I started hearing it more and more on Sirius. And then I kind of got a little bit more into the music. This is a really fantastic album. This is one that, I think is probably one of the better pop punk albums that's been released, in probably the last 6 or 8 years. The next album is one I'm sure is going to end up on a lot of best of lists at the end of the year. And that's a new album from Taylor Swift, The Torture Poets Department. So this came out back on April 19th. And to be completely honest, I wasn't a huge fan of this album when it first came out. It seemed, I don't know, maybe just a little off, a little slower than I was expecting it to be. But the more I've listened to it, the more it's kind of grown on me. I think she took a lot of the better elements of her last 3 albums. So that's Folklore, Evermore, and Midnights, and kind of combined them all together on this one. I think she needs to work with a different producer. I think her and Jack Antonoff, I think their days are hopefully over. I'd like to see her go in a different route and try to do something a little different musically. But, like I said, the more I listen to this album, the more I like it. And I think this has kind of grown into probably one of my favorite albums by her. Next album was also released on April 19th, and I was not expecting this album to be as good as it is. Actually, it's not an album, it's an EP. It's only 5 songs on this one, but that is half album by NoFX. I think that NoFX has really kind of struggled over the last almost 20 years. Ever since Wolves and Wolves Clothing came out back in 2006, I think the band has really been more miss than hit since then. This is the end of a trilogy release. They released, single album was released back in 2021. They released double album in 2022, and they got half album this year. Hands down, I think this is the best music that they've done since 2006. Another band that I didn't know anything about until just recently is the band Super American. This is their latest album, Gangsta Love. I think this is their 3rd album. This came out back on May 31st. And someone recommended this to me in the Facebook group. And to be honest, like the first day I heard this album, the first day I listened to it, I must have listened to it at least 5 or 6 times. This is one of those albums that, I love to see a lot of these newer up and coming punk bands. This sounds like something that could be straight off of like Warped Tour from 1999 or 2000. And, it's an album, it's probably one of my most listened to albums over the last month or so. The next album is one I had on my list earlier this year. It's one of my most anticipated albums of the year, and it hasn't let me down. This album came out back on January 19th, and that is the self-titled album from Neck Deep. Neck Deep is one of those bands that, they're a pop punk band, but they're more, I'd say they're a little more on the poppier side of pop punk. And maybe that's the thing that's kind of kept me away from them for so long. I've listened to a song here or there, kind of casually been on my radar over the last couple of years. But I think when the first couple of singles was released off of this album, or late last year, was really when I started paying more and more attention to them. Started digging a little bit deeper in their music, and it's just a fast, fun album to listen to. And then my last of the honorable mentions is an album that I was really hoping would be in my top 5. I was expecting this, or at least I was hoping this was going to be a truly great album. Still really good. It's just not one I have in my top 5. And that is the last album from Sum 41, Heaven and Hell. It's a really interesting concept they did with this album. So Sum 41 is known for 2 different styles of music. Their earlier music was more pop punk. And then after the first couple of albums, they kind of transitioned to this darker, almost heavy metal kind of music. And so the heaven side of this album is that pop punk side. The hell side is that heavier metal-ish kind of sound. And to be honest, I think they should have done 2 separate albums with this. Had they done that, I think the heaven side of this probably would have been my top 5. So the album that I have at number 5 is probably my most anticipated album of the year, and that is Dark Matter by Pearl Jam. I've been a huge Pearl Jam fan for a long time. This is their 12th studio album. This was released back on April 19th as a follow-up to Gigaton, which was released in 2020. So this is the band's first time working with Andrew Watt. I know Andrew Watt had worked with Eddie Vedder on Earthling, I think is the album that they worked on together. Andrew Watt's done a bunch of stuff over the last several years. He's a great producer, especially when it comes to rock music. So I was really expecting this to be a really good album. I think, like, musically, it's kind of a continuation of what the band did on Gigaton. I think the biggest difference is with Gigaton, it was really it was recorded over like 3 years plus 3.5 years time span. The album was recorded over. It was a bunch of different recording sessions that they worked on the album on. But with this album, it was much more concise. They just got to work in the studio, just a few sessions over a shorter period of time, and it ended up being a more cohesive album. I think that because of that is a lot more focused than what Gigaton was. Even though I thought Gigaton was a good album, I think what they did on Dark Matter, I think, is probably some of their best work of the post-90s, I'd say. The last 24 years, it isn't as good as Lightning Bolt. I think Lightning Bolt is the best thing that they've done since the 90s, but I'd put Dark Matter just behind it. A couple of my favorite tracks on here, Scared of Fear, Wreckage, Dark Matter, and Running. All 4 of those tracks, I think, is the best things off this album. The album that I have at number 4 is an album that, it's another punk album, because I think punk has been, had a great year so far, but this is a band I didn't have any knowledge of until earlier this year. This album came out back on January 5th, but it was probably, I'd say sometime in February when I first found out about these guys. The album is The Runs. The band is named Scooped Up. So this is a punk band from Milford, Connecticut. They're a young band. This is a follow-up to their debut album, which came out back in 2018 called Dumbass. And, it's just a fun, fast punk album, kind of along the same lines as some of those other bands I've talked about. Younger music, younger band coming up. I'd love to see what these guys can do in the future. I think all of their concerts, or most of their concerts in the Connecticut area, I'd love to see a bigger band scoop these guys up, no pun intended, and take them out on tour, because I think they really deserve, to have more exposure. Like I said, the future of punk, I think, is going in a great direction with bands like Scooped Up. Some of my favorite tracks on here, Reruns is a great track. Dyslexic is probably one of my favorite pop punk albums or pop punk songs of the last several years. Best Days, Foolproof, and Crash Test. All those songs are fantastic on there. If you're unfamiliar with Scooped Up, definitely check them out. The album that I have at number 3 is an album that it was one of my most anticipated albums of the year, but I had some big question marks about this album. This one came out back on January 19th, and that is Saviors by Green Day. I'm a huge Green Day fan, have been for a long time. But, so this is a follow-up to Father of All, which came out in 2020. And I thought it was a horrible album. Easily the band's worst album. Most of it's unlistenable. It's grown on me a little bit since it's released. I don't think it's the heaping pile of burning trash that I initially thought it was. But I still think it's nowhere close to anything else the band has done in their career. So musically, this is still kind of a continuation from Father of All. I think there's like 3 or 4 tracks from Father of All sessions that were reworked for this one. This is the first time the band brought back Rob Cavallo since he did the trilogy back in 2012, and I think it really came through on this album. Like I said, musically it's still a continuation, but I think these are better written songs, better lyrics than anything off of Father of All. This album charted the same as Fowler of All. They both hit number 4 on the Billboard 200, but this sold twice as many copies. This is an album that I think is kind of a redeeming album for the band. I think it's probably their best album since American Idiot, one that I've listened to a bunch of times. There's a bunch of great tracks on this one, too. Some of my favorite ones on here are Look Ma No Brains, Bobby Socks, One-Eyed Bastard, Dilemma. Dilemma is probably my favorite post-American Idiot song that the band has done. Goodnight Adeline, Strange Days Are Here to Stay. So many great ones on this album. So the album I have at number 2 has changed a lot. It's moved around a lot over the course of the year. For a while, I had it at number 1. I think it's been as low as number 3. I've got it at number 2 now. We'll see where it lands at the end of the year. This album came out back on January 26th, and that is Blood, Hair, and Eyeballs by Alkaline Trio. This is the band's first album since Matt Skiba rejoined after leaving Blink-182. I don't know if he really left Blink-182, but Tom DeLonge came back to Blink, and there was no room for Matt, so he rejoined Alkaline Trio. I think this is the band's most cohesive album and probably their best album since Crimson was released in 2005. And there's a reason behind that. I think the band all got together. It's the first time the band has worked all together in a recording studio to craft all these songs in a very long time. And it really came through with how good this album is from beginning to end. Some of my favorite tracks on here you got is Hot for Preacher, Versions of You, Blood, Hair, and Eyeballs. Broken Down in a Time Machine is a fantastic track. One of my favorite tracks of the year so far. So that brings me down to my number 1 album of the year so far. I will say, looking back over my last couple of years, doing these mid-year top 5s, I don't think any of my number 1 albums have ended the year as my number 1 album. So we'll see where this album ends on my list at the end of the year. This album came out back on January 26th, and that is East Side of Eden by Jen Razavi. I think if you look her up on Spotify, it's under Jen Pop. So Jen is one half of the co-front women of the pop punk band, the Bomb Pops. So when she announced that she was doing her debut solo album, I didn't know what to expect. I was actually expecting this to be a little more like what she does with the Bomb Pops, where it's more pop punk oriented. That's not what this album is. Yes, there is a couple of tracks like that on this album, but this is much more like singer-songwriter. Some of it has like an acoustic vibe to it. I really love some of the chill stuff that she does on this album. This is all released through her own label, Fox and Clown. It's interesting to see what she does moving forward. I don't know if she's going to go back and work more with Bomb Pops, or is she going to keep going down the solo path, but I can't wait to see what she does. Some of my favorite tracks on this album: Saw in Half, Bender, House of Mirrors. House of Mirrors is a song that has a lot more of a pop punk, Bomb Pops vibe to it. And East Side of Eden, they're all great standout tracks on here. I don't think there's really a bad song on this album, and one that I'm sure I'm going to end up listening to a bunch this year. I'm sure it's going to end up somewhere in my top 5 or top 10 at the end of the year, but I'll just see where it lands. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what your top 5 albums of the year are so far. To be completely honest, looking over my top 5, I really only thought that Pearl Jam album would be in there. Like I said, the Green Day album, I had some high hopes on, but I wasn't really sure because of what happened with Father of All, how this album was going to turn out. But so far, 2024 has been a standout year for music. So many great albums that have come out. I'm sure there's going to be so many more that come out the rest of the year. But, let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.